Track 2. Number 14.
At the grocer's. Mrs. Ford looked at her shopping list. "I want some butter and some cheese," she said, "and a packet of biscuits." "Is that all, Mrs. Ford?" the grocer asked. Mrs. Ford looked at her list again. "No, I want some sugar, some flour, and a packet of tea." "Sugar, flour, and tea," the grocer said, and put them on the counter. "And a tin of tomato soup," Mrs. Ford said. "We haven't any tomato soup," the grocer said. "What are those tins on that shelf?" Mrs. Ford asked. "These, Mrs. Ford?" the grocer asked. "They're tins of tomatoes. Do you want a tin?" "No, thank you." "Is that all, Mrs. Ford?" "Yes, thank you." "Please send them to my house." "Oh, and I want a dozen eggs, too, but don't send them. I'll carry them." "We can send the eggs, too," the grocer said. "No, thank you," Mrs. Ford said. "Your new delivery boy is very careless. Last week he dropped the eggs on my doorstep." Exercise E. Answer these questions. 1. Where is Mrs. Ford? 2. Has she a shopping list? 3. Did Mrs. Ford buy some biscuits or some bread? 4. Has the grocer any tomato soup? 5. Didn't Mrs. Ford want some tomato soup? 6. Aren't there any tins on the shelf? 7. What do these tins contain? 8. Does Mrs. Ford want a tin of tomatoes? 9. Who will send the things to her house? 10. Does Mrs. Ford want 10 eggs or a dozen? 11. Will the grocer send the eggs too? 12. Won't Mrs. Ford carry the eggs? 13. Can't the grocer send the eggs? 14. Is the new delivery boy careless? 15. What did he do last week?